So, yeah, to sum up, if you're anything like me, then you have a notebook that probably looks a bit like this at the moment from various parts of the day. So what I thought I'd just do is I'd just put these up and you can read them. And then this happened, and that's about that. So, no, it's been a fantastic day. So thank you to all of the speakers. As I say, I'm not going to talk about my work particularly at all now. I'm going to focus on a few kind of things that occurred to me coming out of it, just some of the questions, I guess. And then I will try to look at for sort of future a little bit, but not so much, as in I'll talk about now, I think where we are now and how that plays to some of the themes that we've been talking about today. So this particular diagram I thought was really useful and interesting that Martin showed at the start, and then it was repeated a couple of times throughout. This relationship between the individual and the collective and the institutions, and the kind of the flows of resources and responsibility and frameworks backwards and forwards, I thought was really powerful and useful, actually, and generative. And I looked at the speakers, and these are the speakers, and in a funny way, they kind of were on that spectrum as well. I don't know if you planned this, Martin, but it's a genius bit of curation by someone here. This is before the last session, because I'm not that quick. So I had to give it to them in the coffee break. But in a funny way, I think even the last session, which was, again, incredibly interesting, actually started to spread up and down that spectrum a bit. I thought Christian and Dietmar's stuff in particular, I guess, we're looking at the relationship between individuals doing things and then the framework or the legislation or the impact on a systemic level as well. And clearly we also saw that in the most recent presentations, or from a sort of smart cities perspective, and the kind of ideologies baked into that, into the DNA of those things, and unpicking it. And then kind of zooming down to even a charging point, you can see that then, well, that has to play out and be manifest in an individual transaction in some way. And it has a certain kind of political framework baked into that accordingly. So this kind of relationship was really interesting. And so I thought I'd just reflect on some of the things that occurred to me within that. Well, something we heard about a lot was this question of how to scale and whether we should scale. And often working on projects, there's this kind of implicit sense, but yeah, how's this going to scale? As if that is, by definition, a good thing. So we need to even question that. But I'm also picking up sort of Tracy's point during one of the early Q&As about this could seem all very vague and a bit sort of spotty, kind of civic urbanism, tactical urbanism. Will it add up to what we understand a city to be, or a society to be? There seems like sometimes a big gulf between those two things. And clearly there's still language to develop and actions to develop and strategies to develop there as well, because pop-ups sort of, as my colleague Brian Boyer said, pop-ups pop down. You know, that's why they're easy to pop up. You can then take them down again. If they weren't easy to pop up, then they wouldn't pop up. You know, that's almost by definition. Their death is sort of baked into their birth in some way. Incredibly interesting, therefore, from an innovation point of view, because they enable you to prototype or test something that you can't otherwise do, for sure. But that doesn't mean that you necessarily will pull out ongoing systemic change out of that kind of context. So there's this really interesting shift around tactical urbanism, strategic urbanism, what you can do with one approach that you can't do with another. And this is really replete throughout. I wrote an essay once about basically the sort of social media-led tactics around both urbanism, but then at the time, the Arab Spring and Occupy and various things like that. And it occurred to me, I suppose the title was, you can crowdsource a revolution, but you can't crowdsource a light rail system. And that was, that's an odd thing, that we can kind of crowdsource a social revolution at scale, hundreds of thousands of people involved, and shift societies at some level. But it's incredibly hard to use the same tactics to develop something like a light rail system because of the cost and the inertia and the legacy and the framework through which that has to happen with. You can crowdsource allotments, clearly, or kind of community gardens, but can you crowdsource a hospital? Possibly it's the wrong question, but what can you do with those techniques in the context of that? How to be legitimate is kind of baked into that, or how to produce things equitably. This is really a challenge. So, we see a lot of participatory society, as Joost pointed out. In the UK, we used to call it a big society. No one talks about that anymore. It's just sort of move away from that thing, don't look at it. Here it's less so in a way, and I'm doing some interesting work with the New Institute in Eindhoven, with the gemeente Eindhoven about that as well. Looking at actually, can participatory society generate something which is democratically equitable or legitimate? Again, you can pop something up, but that doesn't mean that it's equally spread, that everyone has access to it. So you might have a community center that pops up in a disused bank run by an elderly gentleman for the old people in the community, which at first glance looks like a wonderful thing, a fabulous civic project. But at the same time, you notice it's got no Moroccan people in it because he didn't want them particularly to be there. So a hypothetical example, possibly. So that is very difficult to pull out then something that we're used to from a democratic point of view. Say, well, you have access to all things. So aged care, child care has come up several times. How do you enable that to be equally accessible across a society if you're using a tactical approach of participatory urbanism? May or may not be possible. Equally, though, you can pull out innovation from the participatory tactic. We also know startups struggle with this massively. Startups do not produce things that scale well, actually, or are equitable at all. So Uber works in certain bits of certain cities. It's not public transport. It's not as good as public transport. It's not as scalable as public transport as a result. So we can't just conflate one to the other. What happens in cities, of course, is that exactly happens. You can see people beginning to disinvest in public transport because of things like mobility as a service, without carefully thinking through, well, hang on, will that scale to the edge of Amsterdam on a Sunday morning on an off-peak fare? Might be quite expensive, potentially. It's not the same as paying €3 for the tram. So there's a real problem both with the sort of participatory tactic and startup culture, which several people today, I think, really homed in on and dug into and pointed out very clearly. How to engage. So, we talked a lot about engaging citizens several times today, and again, as was pointed out by Dorian really usefully at the end, the principle of active citizens and engagement is also heavily loaded. Do people want to engage all the time and be active citizens all the time? Absolutely not. So there's that. But again, as Tracy pointed out in one of the Q&As, when we noticed there was no one from the financial sector in the room, we have to engage the rest of society in some of these ideas if we want them to travel well. And I'm not sure we have the right language to get for that or the right approach. So is hackable the right word? Well, I know hackable, speaking as a computer science graduate who's become an urbanist, hackable speaks to me, but it won't speak to many people and will put them off. Now, that may be on purpose, fair enough, or it may be that you then have a chance to explain it, absolutely, but there's a lot of translation required to do there. So engaging with the existing sectors is super important. There's a danger, I think, again, Tracy pointed out in the Q&A sort of implicitly, that we can get into an echo chamber with this debate, that it all makes perfect sense, but then outside, the society is largely the same as it was at 9 o'clock this morning. And they've been working in the last way for the last 50, 60 years or so, and they have to have a good reason to change. So there are wonderful things here, but I think we need to be super clear about the language and the tactics there. Speaking of tactics versus strategy, they're two different things. There's a chess grandmaster called Tarkatawa who once said, tactics are what you do when you know what to do. Strategy is what you do when you don't know what to do. And I'm not sure I fully understand it, as with many kind of chess grandmastery kind of things. But there does seems to be clearly something about the tactical approach where you can say, well, that clearly could be something because we can all see it and locate it and we can speak to 50 people around it, hence the scale issue again. And the tactics gets it done, which is interesting. But does it generate long-term public good? And that's the essence of the city as a public good. Now, collectively, perhaps, yes, out of all of those tactical occurrences, a strategy could emerge. And again, I think Joost and others pointed out today, the stretch between those two is really interesting. Several times it came up today, I thought Christian's talk was fantastic about the diversity of living we have now, and actually that some of these approaches do give us a way of thinking through the sheer diversity of society that we have, just through its approach. So the Baugruppen model was fascinating, I thought, Less so almost the photography, which is beautiful, but the diagrams and the way it began to unpick all of the different shades of living that we have going on now. And you compare that to the traditional built environment model for property development, where you basically have 1-bedroom apartment, 3-bedroom apartment, townhouse, or detached house. And we have to pour all of society into one of those 4 shapes somehow, or 5 or so, which seems absurd in a time when we have, we might have a grandmother looking after the 5 kids from 2 families either side where both parents are going to work, or, it's just this, as we all know, the diversity of living is completely different to what the property sector offers up. And Baugruppen and its ilk gave us an insight into ways forward there. The words at the bottom, by the way, are not just nonsense words I made up, but interesting, the first sort of 2 Japanese architecture practices, Sofo Jimuto and Atelier Bauwau, who do wonderful work, I think, around this more complex way of living together in spaces. And then Niklas Mark, a German writer, wrote a beautiful book called Living Complex, which came out recently in English anyway, maybe a year before in German. Talking exactly about this. And technology's kind of quiet role in enabling that was really interesting, I think. So that was wonderful. Also this idea about building around what and who you know, which I'm a digital designer by background. It makes sense to do this kind of user-centered, iterative, prototype-led design, completely not done at all in the built environment world or the cities world. And what we see with Baugruppen is building around what, as in these are the needs we have as a group, and then who. So these are the people that we can test it with and iterate and prototype and build over time. That was really interesting and insightful. Niklas Mark calls it this kind of radicalization of private space, radicalization of public space, and these kind of shades of privacy and openness in between all of that. So instead of just this binary, there's public and there's private. There's your house and there's the street, or there's the private sector and the public sector. Baugruppen and things are kind of in this messy space in between, which is probably how people are kind of trying to live in the shapes that we haven't built quite right. Several people talked about the resilience beyond bubbles and how some of these approaches do give us a sense of that is something more resilient there. And clearly, I live in London. I work all over the place, but I live in London. We're in Amsterdam. These are cities with overactive property sectors at the moment, perhaps. It's sort of not the problem, in a way. It's a different kind of problem, at least. The rest of the UK is massively... Whoops. Oh, my goodness. I could make a point about resilience, but I won't. So the rest of the UK is not the property sector of London. 10 million people live in London, 50 million people live in a completely different condition economically, and there's a problem around making houses there. You can build anything in London and it'll sell, more or less. That isn't the issue there. It's then how do we build elsewhere? And so what was interesting that some of these tactics or strategies emerged in the crash, or the recession, or the ongoing recession, as we might say, because it's geographically spread, not temporally. That was really powerful because it gives us a sense of that enduring resilience to that approach. I think I made this point, Joost made this point particularly strongly. It's not about startups, and I think Willem also said, why are we looking to the US and the UK here, and as a British man, I reinforce that point. There is a distinctly European approach to this is kind of what I am driving my work towards, and I can sense it in a lot of the people in the room here, because it's something very different. It is very different to what you see in often Anglophone countries. I think UK is sort of half in there, in a European sense at least. I need to be careful what I say at the moment because of referenda and things, but I'm firmly European for what it's worth. And everyone I know is, but anyway. The issue is how do we find a language which takes technologies developed elsewhere, strips them of the baked-in ideologies, and then repurposes them to make sense in Europe? That could be an interesting question, because there are interesting things about those technologies, but to some extent they come from certain cultures, obviously, and so there's a sort of an ideology baked into them, just as an ideology baked into Horizon 2020, as you pointed out. So it's not about startups being the answer, but equally it's not about the technology that startups produce being just simply an answer of adopting it and dropping it into Amsterdam or Eindhoven or Genk. It's really quite a different thing. And then from Troci's Q&As, there are a few things. I've talked about a few of them, but I really like this point that was made here around designers around this sort of humility and carefulness and having a tough skin, but not the tough skin of a jerk, which I think you said, which was nicely put. And there's no one from finance, as I said. Is this all just pie in the sky? Which occurs to me it would be a great name for a drone-based food delivery startup, but not what you meant, obviously. But the sense that design practice has a lot of the clues, but it might not be distributed yet, to borrow William Gibson, and to learn what we can ask, which was a really lovely philosophical point, I think. So finally, I think on this kind of spectrum, it felt like me that the difficult bit is the right-hand side of that, the kind of collective to institutional end to some extent. As in individuals, we sort of saw a lot of activity. Of course we see a lot of activity. People do stuff. People get stuff done all the time. The challenge is what happens when it becomes collective. As I've pointed out, the participatory approach enables innovation, but it can be spotty and patchy and not democratic. And then how then does the institution absorb the learning from that without killing it? So how would a planning system absorb the genius of Baugruppen without crushing it to death? That would be the interesting question there. And so these kind of the shift towards the right, the job of the institution in a way is to enable the scaling equitably across the society to say, that's interesting, that pop-up mobility thing, or that approach to childcare, or this approach to Baugruppen, how can everybody potentially benefit from that? That's sort of why we invented that institution in the first place to some extent. I did a really lame diagram in the book, which is something I wrote about and drew slightly more carefully in a book that I wrote, but this kind of very spotty, kind of fractured approach to innovation is, I just loosely say, America and Britain does this kind of very fractured, spotty approach to innovation. So let's take education. Say you get Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and Yale, but the average American education is not great. Just sorry for anybody in the room who's been through it or is working in it. I'm just apologizing in advance. So it's very, very kind of up and down. You get amazing centers of world learning amongst the best in the world, but then you equally don't get a great level for everybody. Same with healthcare. Clearly, if you have the money, you get the best healthcare in the world. But the average level of healthcare, not great. And super expensive and not, just not well done. Whereas if you look at the line below, which I've just called Euro, but I drew it when I was in Finland, because I think Finland is probably the most clear example of this. You get an average level for everybody, which is relatively high, but it's very average. So you don't get massive diversity or spikes there. The education is great for everybody, but it's not Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge. So it doesn't generate the spike of innovation, but it absorbs it and makes it available. Generally, you could make, I think, with architecture, the same point. The average building in Helsinki is beautifully well made, actually fairly average. So there's a few jewels there like Saarinen and Aalto, but the average thing is just kind of, it's not, it's good, it's perfectly good. Whereas in the UK, there's terrible, terrible housing, but also you get some spikes of innovation like Zaha or Foster or whatever. So the challenge would be, how do we absorb diversity and innovation into that system? Because what the lower line does, this kind of average level for everybody, doesn't change in times of diversity, and it struggles to adapt because it doesn't have the spikes of innovation absorbed so readily. So in Helsinki, say, where I worked at the time, it was diversifying rapidly. It was going from something like 7% non-Finn born to around 20% over the next 5-10 years or so. So how that system changed to enable high level of education for everybody is the huge challenge there. So how do you enable a spike of innovation to occur, absorb that into a system of institutions, one way or another, without killing the spike of innovation? So that's the kind of odd line on the right there, is that kind of slightly fat middle, which has these kind of little nudges, kind of trying to pull it into place there, but still has this kind of spikes of innovation occurring as well. I think I might leave you with a final point about the way I see this thing then going forward. I'm kind of calling this at the moment kind of a grid versus a non-grid based approach, for want of a better word. But on the left-hand side, I'll explain this in a minute properly. There are these kind of non-grid systems, a lot of what we've talked about today, decentralized, distributed, and so on. On the right-hand side, just call it grid, just for the sake of argument, bear with me. So most clearly, the electricity grid is a gridded system. It's built out at scale. So when you're making an urban development, you build the whole grid out for the life of the urban development pretty much as you possibly can. Anyway, it's economic to do so. While you've dug up the road, you might as well make it all there. A non-grid based system would be photovoltaic cells on the roof and Tesla Powerwall in the basement. So battery storage begins to unlock the possibility to be not in the grid, which is something we used to associate with in the countryside or on the beach or something. Now it could be in the city. That's really kind of complex and interesting from an urban point of view. You can go off-grid in a city, which could be wonderful in terms of tactical urbanism and enabling cities to build themselves, to self-build, self-make. Equally, you could see if that's handled incorrectly, people would say, hang on, why am I paying my taxes? Because I'm paying for myself, buddy. So, so the politics, again, embedded within the way those things manifest themselves is really intensely interesting and complex. And we need, again, I suggest a European response for that for a city like this one. We could have, WikiHouse or Siegel method building or Baugruppen, as we've seen on the left-hand side, or the kind of the big building structure that the property market usually shows. We've got autonomous on-demand mobility on the left-hand side there, a non-grid-based system. It runs on the existing roads. If you try and solve transit in a 20th century grid point of view, you make a rail line or you make a light rail system or so on. It's a grid-based system, hub and spoke, heavy investment, pays off over time. Now, both of these aren't in opposition necessarily. I'm saying that the interesting thing would be to think about them together. So when do you need to build the grid, and when can you be off-grid, and how does that work in the same place? Same with transport. Can you get by with, say, autonomous Uber or Zipcar or a public transport version of the same thing, something coming on demand, a taxi basically, a minibus, a bus, whatever? And when do you need to build a mass transit line? When do you need to build a railway? And at the moment, we've been solving things by building the big stuff, building the railway, building the mass transit line, building out the big developments, as several people have pointed out. We now have this option. How can we use one to inform the other? Do we need to build a railway? Well, maybe not just yet. Maybe we get by with mobility on demand for a while. Then if we see that that can't handle it, then we double down, we build something. So you see the same with politics, as people have pointed out, this kind of different decision-making systems. You see the same with robotics. I'll skip through all of the examples because you know them all. And there's one just around the corner. So finally, I'm borrowing your humble and careful words, but decisively co-opt technology. I use co-opt on purpose because I mean examining, as you pointed out, the ideologies baked into those things and ideally dislocating the tech from the ideology and then saying, what do we want there? What makes sense in a social democratic European mid-sized city? It must be different to sometimes where the technology came from. So we have to examine that very carefully. But could we co-opt all of the things I just flicked through because you know them all? To me, there's something very interesting in all those technologies, but only if we bring them to bear in that way. So all of this stuff, we're working on principles around how do you build a sort of a incomplete city, if you like. You don't try and build complete. You actually build incomplete, and then you build in the capability for the city to make itself over time, to adapt itself, to iterate. So you build around what you know again. All of those kind of technologies there could enable that to some degree. And when I say technologies, of course, things like technologies, as Christian pointed out, a ballot box is a technology, so decision-making systems are part of that. And it's a really different design process, a really different management process, a really different development process. We don't have a good picture of what that looks like, I don't think. Everything we've seen today is kind of sketches in that direction, but how all that comes together for a city is super interesting. They have a certain set of conditions, which I won't dwell on, but words like that. Some of those are highly loaded, some of them aren't. Some of them are open and neutral, some of them are not. So this kind of grid, non-grid is how I started thinking about it. Talking to Christine over lunch, she pointed out, so that's really interesting because I kept saying like a social democratic city, and she said, well, you've got the social and the democratic. And there's the two sides of that in an interesting way. So, the social is kind of the tactical and the sort of citizen to collective, and then it becomes democratic when it's collective to institutionalized to some degree. So again, on Martin's kind of spectrum kind of works of that individual, collective, institutional. And the final slide I'll leave you with is, what is this for Europe? Because I'm a passionate European for what it's worth, but that's the cities I live and work in. Google Campus, where they've brought these technologies together, and I've worked with them on some of these projects for what it's worth. When it comes out of their design process, interestingly with an English designer and a Danish designer, it looks like this, which is California. It sort of makes sense. But that's what a street looks like in the Google campus. It's built for autonomous vehicles. So there's no need for curbs and traffic lights and, you know, lanes and stuff. It's like a track through the Californian Sierra or something. But what is that? All of those same technologies played out in the context that we live and work in a European city. It's not like that, but what is it like? Thank you.
The one thing that makes me really happy in your talk, Dan, is that apparently we can switch back and forth from the one to the other, from the non-grid to the grid and back again, without being constrained by ideology or by social pressure. That they're permeable. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah, it's not that we're not constrained by it, because clearly we are. It's just that we have to actively address that and figure out how to weld those things together in a way that makes sense. Again, for Amsterdam or Rotterdam or Eindhoven, you know, it's different across those cities, of course. Never mind Berlin, never mind then Manchester. And each particular city will has all of those options available to them. So I think the job is to look at that with very open eyes and say, what's the kind of city that we want? Then we can talk about the technology.